The year is 1859. The American frontier stretches westward toward the Pacific, a vast wilderness where nations jostle for territory and settlers carve out precarious lives in disputed lands. The United States and Great Britain, two global powers with a history of conflict, stand on the brink of war. The flashpoint? A pig. This is the story of the Pig War, the most absurd, most civilized, and perhaps most important conflict that never quite happened. To understand how a single swine nearly ignited an international catastrophe, we need to travel back 14 years to 1846, when the United States and Britain sat down to settle their territorial squabbles in the Pacific Northwest. For decades, both nations had claimed the Oregon Country, a massive territory stretching from California to Alaska. American settlers poured westward along the Oregon Trail. The British Hudson's Bay Company controlled the fur trade. Tensions mounted. War seemed inevitable. But cooler heads prevailed. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 seemed like a triumph of diplomacy. It drew a clean line across the map. The 49th parallel would separate British North America from the United States. Problem solved. Except it wasn't. The treaty stated that the border would continue west to the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island. Simple enough until you realize there wasn't just one channel, there were two. The Haro Strait, running along the western edge of the San Juan Islands, and the Rosario Strait, running along the eastern edge. The treaty didn't specify which one. The Americans looked at their maps and said, obviously we meant Haro Strait. The San Juan Islands are ours. The British looked at the exact same treaty and said, obviously we meant Rosario Strait. The islands are ours. And there, floating in legal limbo between two empires, sat the San Juan Islands, 172 islands and reefs, rich in resources, strategically positioned, and completely up for grabs. For over a decade, this ambiguity festered. American settlers arrived, staking claims. The Hudson's Bay Company operated a massive sheep ranch, treating the islands as British territory. Two flags flew, two legal systems claimed jurisdiction. Everyone just tried not to think about it too hard. Until one American farmer had absolutely enough of a certain British pig. His name was Lyman Cutler, a farmer from Kentucky who'd made his way west seeking opportunity and land. He'd built a cabin on San Juan Island's southern end, cleared a plot, planted potatoes. The American dream. Or it would have been if not for his neighbor's livestock. The pig belonged to the Hudson's Bay Company, specifically to an Irishman named Charles Griffin, who managed the company's Bellevue sheep farm. It was a large black boar with an appetite for destruction and absolutely no respect for property boundaries. Day after day, the pig would wander onto Cutler's land. Day after day, it would root through his potato patch, destroying his crops. Cutler complained. He tried fencing. He tried chasing the animal off. Nothing worked. The pig kept coming back. On the morning of June 15, 1859, Cutler looked out and saw that damned pig in his potatoes again. He'd had enough. He grabbed his rifle. One shot, the pig was dead. Now, in any reasonable world, this would have been a minor property dispute. An apology, maybe some compensation. Move on. But remember, this wasn't actually about a pig. Charles Griffin was furious. He reported the incident to British authorities, who saw this as an American settler destroying British property on British land. They demanded Cutler pay $100 in compensation, a substantial sum in 1859. Cutler offered 10. The British refused. They threatened to arrest him and have him tried under British law. Cutler, being an American citizen on what he considered American soil, wasn't about to submit to British arrest. He appealed to U.S. authorities for protection. And just like that, a dead pig became an international incident. The American settlers on San Juan Island were terrified. If British authorities could arrest Cutler, they could arrest anyone. Their land claims, their livelihoods, their safety, all of it suddenly felt precarious. They sent urgent messages to Brigadier General William S. Harney, commander of the U.S. Army's Department of Oregon. Harney was not a man inclined toward restraint. Hot-tempered, aggressive, and fiercely nationalistic, he saw the pig incident as British overreach that demanded a military response. He ordered Captain George E. Pickett to deploy to San Juan Island with 66 men from Company D, 9th U.S. Infantry. He established camp near the Hudson's Bay Company's facilities and sent a message to the British that was polite in tone but unmistakable in meaning. "This is American territory. We're here to stay." The British response was swift. 3 Royal Navy warships arrived: HMS Tribune, HMS Satellite, and HMS Plumper. They carried more than 2,000 soldiers and Marines, a force that outnumbered Pickett's tiny garrison by more than 30 to 1. The ship's guns were trained on the American position. A single command could have reduced Pickett's camp to splinters. Captain Geoffrey Phipps Hornby, commander of the British Naval Squadron, went ashore to meet with Pickett. The conversation that followed would determine whether 2 great powers went to war over a pig. Hornby was direct. He had overwhelming force. He could drive the Americans off the island in an afternoon. But he asked Pickett, was he really prepared to start a war? Pickett, to his credit, or perhaps his foolhardiness, stood firm. His orders were to hold the island. He would hold the island. Hornby could have attacked. He had the authority. His superiors expected him to reassert British control, but he didn't. In his later report, Hornby wrote that he would not be the man who started a war between Britain and the United States over a squabble about a pig. It was, he felt, beneath the dignity of both nations. Absolute king behavior, as the kids might say. Instead of fighting, both sides did something extraordinary. They agreed to disagree, peacefully. News of the crisis traveled slowly in 1859, but when it reached Washington, D.C. and London, both capitals were horrified. President James Buchanan, already dealing with the looming secession crisis that would lead to civil war, dispatched General Winfield Scott, the Army's commanding general, to negotiate a solution. The British, equally eager to avoid conflict, agreed to talks. Scott was everything Harney wasn't: diplomatic, measured, cautious. He arrived in October 1859 and immediately began negotiations with British Governor James Douglas. The solution they crafted was elegant in its simplicity: joint military occupation. American forces would remain on the southern end of San Juan Island. British forces would establish a camp on the northern end. Both would stay until diplomats could negotiate a final settlement. No hostilities, no provocations, just waiting. And wait they did for 12 years. From 1859 to 1872, American and British soldiers lived as neighbors on San Juan Island. They were technically on the brink of war. In practice, they became friends. Officers from both camps socialized regularly. They held joint celebrations on the 4th of July and the Queen's birthday. They competed in sports. They shared supplies during harsh winters. One British officer later recalled that the Americans were capital fellows, and the arrangement was exceedingly pleasant. It was the Cold War, but make it polite. The armed standoff, but with tea parties. Imagine explaining this to the politicians back home. Yes, sir, we're still technically in a territorial dispute that could trigger war between our empires, but Jenkins and I are having a cricket match on Thursday, and the Americans are bringing that excellent whiskey they have. The pig that started it all was long since forgotten, reduced to ham and bacon, no doubt. But the question it raised remained: who owned the San Juan Islands? By 1871, both nations were ready for a permanent solution. The Treaty of Washington established a framework for resolving several outstanding disputes between the United States and Britain, including the San Juan boundary question. But rather than negotiating directly, both sides had dug in too deep for that. They agreed to something revolutionary: third-party arbitration. They would let Wilhelm I, Emperor of Germany, decide. He would review both nations' claims, examine the maps and treaty language, and make a binding determination. On October 21, 1872, Wilhelm issued his ruling. The border would follow the Haro Strait. The San Juan Islands belonged to the United States. The British garrison packed up and withdrew. American sovereignty was established. After 13 years of dispute, the question was finally settled, not through war, not through gunboat diplomacy, through law, patience, and the willingness of two great powers to let someone else make the call.
Today, you can visit both camps on San Juan Island, the American camp with its windswept prairie and historic buildings, the British camp with its formal gardens and white-painted barracks. They're preserved as national historical parks, monuments to a war that never happened. The Pig War is often dismissed as a footnote, a curiosity, a funny story about how stupid international relations can get. But that misses the point entirely. The Pig War demonstrated something profound about the mid-19th century. Britain and the United States were transitioning from rivals to partners. Despite decades of hostility, the Revolution, the War of 1812, countless diplomatic spats, both nations recognized they had more to gain from cooperation than conflict. Captain Hornby's refusal to start a war over a pig, that was a choice, a deliberate decision that human dignity and international stability mattered more than territorial pride. The joint occupation, that was trust. Two armed forces from historically hostile nations coexisting peacefully for over a decade. The arbitration, that was the future, the recognition that disputes could be resolved through law rather than violence. Consider the timing. This happened in 1859, the same year as the Second Italian War of Independence, the year John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, 2 years before the American Civil War would kill 600,000 people.
The world wasn't peaceful. Nations went to war over far less than disputed islands worth millions in resources and strategic value. But Britain and the United States chose differently. That choice echoes through history. The special relationship between Britain and America, the alliance that would prove decisive in 2 world wars, the partnership that helps anchor the modern international order, it didn't emerge from nowhere. It was built through small decisions, accumulated over decades, to choose dialogue over violence, to recognize shared interests, to see the humanity in the supposed enemy. The Pig War also taught a harder lesson, the danger of vague language in treaties. The Oregon Treaty's ambiguous reference to the middle of the channel created 13 years of crisis. It put soldiers on a collision course. It cost both nations money, attention, and diplomatic capital. Modern treaty makers learned from this. Borders are now defined with GPS precision. Language is scrutinized. Ambiguity is the enemy. And yet, disputes still happen. Borders are still contested. Nations still face the choice between escalation and restraint. The pig, whose name, incidentally, history never recorded, died for nothing and everything. It didn't start a war, but it revealed the mechanisms that prevent wars. It showed that even when tensions rise, even when forces are deployed, even when national pride is at stake, there's always a choice. You can pull the trigger, or you can decide that some things, maybe most things, aren't worth dying over. The British camp still has a formal garden, carefully maintained, where officers once entertained their American counterparts. The American camp still has the parade ground where soldiers drilled while watching British ships in the harbor. They're peaceful places now, quiet, beautiful. No monuments to glorious victory, no tributes to fallen heroes. Just a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are the wars we choose not to fight. The San Juan Islands remain American territory. The border dispute that once threatened to ignite a war is now commemorated with twin parks where visitors can walk between former adversaries' camps in minutes. The pig remains the only casualty of the Pig War, and somewhere in the archives there's probably still an invoice for $100 in pig damages, forever unpaid.